One of the big trends shaping culture today is Generation Z. How many people are millennialed out? A lot of us have, talked about millennials for a long time. So this is the next generation. They're born between 1995 and 2010. There's 60 million of them in the US. They have been dubbed the digital natives. They are the ones who famously swiped left on their TV screens when they were toddlers. But what we've found about this generation is that they are as native to digital content as they are nostalgic for the pre-digital days. So when we asked them, if you could erase your entire digital footprint, would you? 52% of them said yes, absolutely. And this is bigger than just a story of sort of social media burnout. That's a piece of it. But really, I think what this speaks to is them wanting to really undo the entire digital web and know what it was like to live in a time where you actually could get caught in a rainstorm, or you had 10 friends, not 10,000. You could actually find a dive bar that didn't already have a Yelp review. 83% of them are nostalgic for the pre-digital days, and things that run the gamut from the library, because Google's just too exhaustive, to courtship in the real world, not online. So definitely interesting to look out for Generation Z. Okay, next trend, urbanization. Lots of innovation happening from the fact that we are living in close quarters. More people are living in densely populated environments. We know this. One of the most fascinating things, other than some of the sort of living trends of, the we lives of the world and more accommodations for people who live alone, like micro apartments, is this idea of how can we make our cities as nimble as the technology that surrounds them. And there's this really interesting organization called Startup Cities, and Zachary Caceres had founded this, and he sort of sees cities as the original social networks. He says it's not about the buildings, it's not about the brick and mortar, it's about people's interactions. We have been able to really sort of fast fuel these interactions in the digital world, but we haven't really been able to keep pace in cities. How do we do that? And his idea is to take the culture from Silicon Valley, from startup culture, and implement that to get our cities up to speed. So he feels like, let's section off that one block, let's section off that one neighborhood, use it as a beta test for a larger social interaction. If it works, roll it out. He also believes that first movers in that space, the residents, the investors, they should get a share of that neighborhood, of that block. And if it increases in value, let's say real estate prices go up because what they're doing is working, they get a payoff from it. So lots of innovation happening in urbanization. That's just one example. Okay, we're going to move on to the next one, sustainability pricing. Most of us are familiar with dynamic pricing. This is what happens when you are in a car share service at midnight and all of a sudden the rate hikes up. But one of the coolest sort of applications for dynamic pricing is in sustainability. I always use the example of when I go to the grocery store, I get a gallon of milk, and no matter, I have a family of 5, we drink, a gallon in a day, I still reach to the back of the shelf to get the freshest milk because I'm paying the same price. Why would I want the one that's less fresh? But the fact of the matter is, I could easily buy the one that would expire earlier and do a lot of social good, because 40% of all food created in America each year is tossed. It's just thrown in the garbage. So if you could somehow make dynamic pricing attached to SKUs, so someone's incentivized to purchase the one with the expiration date that is sooner, you could change a lot for good. And it's not just in the food space and perishables. There's a lot of experimentation in the city space with how can we better regulate traffic and parking. There's been really interesting experiments in San Francisco where they decided to use smart meters to gauge the demand for parking, and they hiked up the parking prices in places that had high demand, lowered it in other places. The results after 2 years were pretty phenomenal. They had in the test area 2,400 fewer miles driven, 50% reduction of circling. This actually kind of lent to about a 30% reduction in greenhouse gas emissions as compared to 6% in the city overall. And they still made $3.3 million more in meter fares. And that's even after a $500,000 loss in parking citations. So they did a lot of good just by creating this sort of dynamic pricing. Okay, let's move on to the next one. This one's interesting, live stories. So just a few years ago, it felt as though digital had killed live. It felt like people were watching what they wanted, when and where they wanted it. It wasn't about kind of when and where it actually happened. So people were watching digitally. It's interesting now that all of a sudden, digital has sort of given and breathed new life into live stories. You look back just, over the past week or so, and you can see the impact that these live stories have had from Facebook Live, the citizen journalism covering some of the police brutality. So sad story, but really kind of giving gravitas. Here's a story that probably would have never made the nightly news, and now it's garnering national attention from live streaming. When you look at Snapchat, I think there's also really powerful examples. This is Mecca Live. It was last year. Snapchat in its live stories forum gets about 10 million to 20 million viewers every single day. And they provide them with windows into worlds that they wouldn't otherwise be able to access. So I think that you're going to see a real resurgence of live, driven kind of coincidentally by digital. All right, next trend, number 6. I love this one. This is sort of ze, they, yo. These are all new pronouns taking the place of he and she. It's not new news that gender is not binary anymore. There's more of a continuum than ever before. But I think what's fascinating is how much digital is driving this trend. Case in point, if you look at the census, you've got male, female. You look at Facebook, you have something like 58 gender options with a fill in the blank as well. It's this idea of all of a sudden people who probably never fell in those two buckets have a definition, an identity. They can connect with others who help to validate that identity, and that creates more proliferation. This is important because our culture is coded by gender, whether we want to admit it or not. It's coded in our retail stores. It's coded in our workplaces. So what happens when that coding changes and things really do dimensionalize? How do we need to change our businesses? How do we need to change our HR departments? There's a lot of implications here. And it's not just kind of the broadening of the spectrum of gender. It's also sexuality. It's race. 80% of Gen Ys and Gen Zs believe that at least one demographic like that falls on a spectrum. Okay. Getting down to the last ones here. Number 5, neuropriming. Halo Neuroscience came out with this gear that basically you put on if you're an athlete. It sends electric currents through your brain and it helps you perform better in sports. I think this is fascinating. The founder of the company says that it can actually take back your cognitive life by 25 years. I'm not really sure if that's true, but they've been getting fascinating results. Things like ski jumpers being able to jump 31% more powerfully once they've been neuroprimed. In other areas, neuroenhancements are also taking off, specifically with Adderall in college campuses. So it's the second most abused drug right now in college campuses, right after alcohol, right before marijuana. And when we talk to kids, they're sort of like, I feel like I can't give it up. My parents were the ones to push it on me in the first place. Now I need to take it to keep up to the school that I got into. I got to take it to keep up with my peers. And one kid even said to us, if Adderall were available over the counter, we'd all get 4.0s. And I think it just opens up this question with the whole area of neuro is like, what amount of enhancement is enough? And are we ever going to kind of feel as though we've gone far enough? So it's just an ethical and interesting question in that space. Okay, number 4. Hashtag woke. Okay, this is taking on new meaning of recent, but the big story here is that we're at a time in the world where there's a lot of world issues, and we've never been less religious. There's a lot fewer places for us to go to seek out answers, and so instead of going to church, people are going to Google, and they're Googling big life questions. We definitely have a generation of digital truth seekers. 23% of people say that they actually Google big life questions, things like, should I have a third child? Or, what's the meaning of life? And they're actually getting really profound answers as they go down that digital rabbit hole. So just keep in mind that this next generation has kind of swapped out traditional religion for a digital version. Okay. Number 3, indie living. One of the biggest trends changing the world is people living alone. This has been out there for quite some time, but the statistics are impressive. Back in 1960, 44% of the U.S. population were in nuclear households. Today it's 21%. Over the past 20 years, there's been an 80% increase globally of people living alone. There needs to be new accommodations, new businesses, new services, but I think what's fascinating is that technology's kind of stepped in where nuclear family has left off. So now if you don't have that handyman husband, you've got TaskRabbit to put together the IKEA furniture. If you don't have the homemaker wife, you've got the meal delivery service kit. So really fascinating to see how we're, accommodating this new single life. Number 2. I'm going to go through this quickly. Okay, obviously, education has to be completely rethought. One of the fascinating things that we found in a recent study is that 50% of teens today plan to charter their own DIY education. They don't necessarily believe in the 4-year plan anymore, and probably for good reason, based on how that's netted out for the previous generation. Also interesting, 41% of this generation of teens say that they're already doing some paid gig work. So you're going to see a massive increase of people kind of going to school, doing the gig work, and making it in new ways, and really new institutions accommodating them. I have 28 seconds to do the last one. All right, so GLOMOs, Social Global Mobile Tribes. This woman is from Advanced Style. I love her. I love Instagram because all of a sudden these niche groups that weren't necessarily relevant in culture before have connected with other people just like them all across the globe. 60% of young people today have a friend from another country, and they're all of a sudden getting validated and becoming relevant and popping up on the scene. And advanced style has made sort of the 65 plus set cool again. All of a sudden we're seeing trends really trickle down from seniors, but it's not just them. Hybrid cultures is another real interesting area for this. For example, Blaxicans, Black Mexicans. Well, it's sort of like there's this guy that started this Blaxicans of Instagram tribe, and he said, yeah, I've always been half Black and half Mexican, but that's not my entire identity. The whole is greater than the sum of its parts. But until I was able to connect with other people like me online and experience that culture, I didn't fully understand it. Mipsters, Muslim hipster women, and many other groups after that.